The Zephyrian Collective prided themselves on being the galaxy's most sophisticated tracking specialists, which was rather like boasting about being the universe's finest door-to-door vacuum salesman. Sure, it was technically impressive, but the real question was whether anyone actually wanted their services. Unfortunately for the rest of the galaxy, the Zephyrians had convinced themselves that everyone did. Commander Vexthul adjusted his bioluminescent collar with the kind of self-satisfied air that only came from centuries of successful hunting. His species had evolved on a planet where everything moved in predictable patterns. Prey animals that migrated along ancient routes, weather systems that followed mathematical precision, even their own civilization that had developed according to carefully calculated societal algorithms. To the Zephyrians, the universe was a grand clockwork mechanism, and they were the master clockmakers. Motion is truth, Vexthul often proclaimed to his subordinates, a phrase that sounded profound until you realized it was basically meaningless. But meaningless or not, it had served the Zephyrians well. Their tracking technology could predict the movement of entire stellar formations, chart the migration patterns of spacefaring species across light years, and calculate the orbital mechanics of civilizations they'd never even met. They were so good at it that other species had started hiring them to track their own stuff, which should have been the first red flag that maybe, just maybe, they were overcomplicating things. Dr. Crixana floated beside the command console, her tentacles interfacing with the quantum processing unit that hummed with barely contained computational power. She was the Collective's premier motion prediction specialist, a title that came with both considerable prestige and the nagging suspicion that she was essentially a very expensive fortune teller. Her algorithms could process movement data from billions of sources simultaneously, creating predictive models so complex that even she sometimes wondered if they were actually working or just generating very convincing nonsense. "The Terran contract has been approved," she announced, her voice carrying that particular tone of professional excitement that suggested she was either genuinely thrilled or had been programmed to sound that way. "Full planetary surveillance, complete movement analysis, and behavioral prediction modeling for the entire human population." Vexthul's facial tendrils rippled with amusement. Humans? Those chaotic, unpredictable bipeds who had somehow stumbled their way into interstellar relevance despite having all the organizational skills of a particularly drunk asteroid field. The Galactic Commerce Authority had hired the Zephyrians to monitor human movements, ostensibly for trade route optimization, but everyone knew the real reason. Humans were expanding too quickly, settling in too many places, and generally making everyone else nervous with their tendency to show up where they weren't expected. "Primitive motion patterns," Vexthul mused, reviewing the initial data on human civilization. "Random urban development, chaotic transportation networks, completely unpredictable individual behavior. This should be straightforward." The irony, of course, was that this confidence was precisely what made the Zephyrians so effective at tracking everything else in the galaxy. They approached each new species with the absolute certainty that given enough data and processing power, any movement pattern could be decoded, predicted, and ultimately controlled. It was a philosophy that had served them well for millennia, right up until they encountered a species that had evolved not to be tracked, but to track. Within 48 hours, the Zephyrian tracking network had deployed 17 quantum satellites around Earth, each one equipped with sensors so sensitive they could detect individual molecules changing direction. The satellites themselves were marvels of engineering, capable of processing movement data in real time and feeding it directly to the Collective's central processing cores. If a human sneezed in Mumbai, the satellites would not only detect it but also calculate the probable trajectory of every expelled droplet. The first week of data collection went exactly as expected, which is to say it went absolutely nowhere. Human cities appeared to be exercises in controlled chaos, with transportation networks that seemed to follow no discernible pattern beyond get from point A to point B, while stopping at every possible point in between. Individual humans moved through their daily routines with the kind of randomness that suggested they were either following some incomprehensibly complex algorithm or making decisions based on whatever they happened to be thinking about at any given moment. "The urban movement patterns are unusual," Dr. Crixana reported during the first status meeting, her tentacles twitching with barely contained frustration. "Their transportation systems appear to be designed for maximum inefficiency. They have vehicles that move in predictable patterns, but the humans inside them seem to be going to completely random destinations." Bexthal studied the holographic display showing human movement patterns across Earth's major population centers. The data looked like someone had taken a bowl of spaghetti and thrown it at a wall, then tried to decode the resulting pattern using advanced mathematics. There were flows and eddies, concentrations and dispersals, but no overall structure that made sense according to any known movement theory. Perhaps they're following resource distribution patterns, suggested junior analyst Morgax, whose youth and enthusiasm made him the kind of subordinate who still believed problems could be solved through sheer optimism. Most species organize their movements around resource acquisition. We've analyzed their resource distribution, Crixana replied, her tone suggesting that junior analyst Morgax had just suggested they solved the problem by asking humans nicely to move in straight lines. It doesn't correlate with movement patterns at all. They have abundant resources in some areas and sparse resources in others, but population density and movement patterns seem completely divorced from resource availability. This was the first indication that the Zephyrians might be dealing with something beyond their considerable experience. Every other species they'd studied had movement patterns that correlated with survival needs: food, shelter, reproduction, territorial expansion. Even the most chaotic civilizations eventually revealed underlying biological or environmental imperatives that drove their behavior. Humans seemed to move just because they felt like it, which was either the most sophisticated behavioral camouflage in galactic history or evidence that they were collectively insane. The second week brought new complications. The Zephyrians' predictive algorithms, which had successfully modeled the movement patterns of over 3,000 species across the galaxy, began generating error messages when applied to human data. Not calculation errors or processing failures, but actual error messages that roughly translated to, "This doesn't make sense," in the mathematical vernacular of quantum computing. The humans appear to be moving in patterns that violate basic principles of efficient motion, Dr. Crixana reported, her professional composure beginning to crack like ice on a warming planet. They frequently travel long distances for no apparent reason, gather in large groups with no clear purpose, and their individual movement patterns change dramatically based on factors we haven't been able to identify. Bexthal frowned, which was an impressive feat for a being whose face consisted primarily of sensory organs and breathing apparatus. Unknown factors? We're monitoring everything: resource flows, environmental conditions, social interactions, even their primitive entertainment broadcasts. What factors could we possibly be missing? The answer, it turned out, was essentially everything that mattered. The Zephyrians had approached human behavior with the assumption that movement patterns were driven by rational decision-making processes, which was roughly equivalent to studying ocean currents while ignoring the existence of wind. They were measuring the symptoms while completely missing the disease, cataloging the effects while remaining oblivious to the cause. By the third week, the Zephyrian tracking project had become something of a joke among the other species in the galactic community. Word had spread that the mighty Zephyrians, who could predict the exact moment a pulsar would shift its rotation by analyzing gravitational wave patterns, were being baffled by bipedal mammals who had only recently figured out how to leave their own solar system. "I heard they've requisitioned additional processing cores," chuckled Ambassador Velteroth of the Crystalline Hegemony during a diplomatic reception. "Apparently they're throwing more computational power at the human problem than they used to track the Great Migration of Andromeda." The Crystalline Hegemony's amusement was particularly galling because they were generally considered the galaxy's most boring species, capable of finding entertainment in watching continental drift happen in real time. If they were laughing at the Zephyrians, it meant the situation had moved beyond professional embarrassment into the realm of cosmic comedy. Bexthal had responded to the mounting ridicule by doubling down on the tracking effort, because when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and when you're a tracking specialist, everything looks like a movement pattern that just needs more analysis. Additional satellites were deployed, more sensitive sensors were activated, and the processing power dedicated to human movement analysis was increased to levels that would have been considered excessive for mapping the quantum structure of space-time itself. The fourth week brought the first glimmer of a pattern, though it was a pattern that made less sense than random movement would have. Human populations were shifting, but not in the chaotic, unpredictable way the Zephyrians had initially observed. Instead, they were moving with a kind of purposeful randomness that suggested coordination without revealing organization. "The movement patterns are becoming more structured," Dr. Crixana reported, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely sure whether this was good news or bad news. But the structure doesn't conform to any known organizational model. It's as if they're following a plan that we can't detect. This was the moment when a more perceptive species might have considered the possibility that humans were aware of being watched. The Zephyrians, however, were committed to their worldview with the kind of intellectual stubbornness that had made them excellent at tracking predictable species and terrible at adapting to unpredictable ones. They interpreted the emerging patterns as evidence that their analysis was finally working, rather than evidence that their analysis was being deliberately manipulated. The truth was considerably more unsettling. Humans hadn't been moving randomly at all. They'd been moving strategically, positioning themselves according to plans that had been developed decades before the Zephyrians had even heard of Earth. The chaos that had confused the alien tracking systems wasn't the result of primitive organizational skills or random decision-making. It was camouflage, designed to hide the fact that humanity had been preparing for exactly this kind of surveillance for longer than most species had been spacefaring. General Reyes stood in the command center of NORAD, watching displays that showed the positions of every Zephyrian satellite in Earth's orbital space. The tracking network that the aliens thought was secretly monitoring human activity was itself being monitored by systems that had been designed specifically to detect and analyze alien surveillance technology. It was an impressive reversal of roles, made possible by the fact that humans had been assuming they were being watched since the day they'd first looked up at the stars and wondered if anyone was looking back. The Zephyrians are increasing their analysis frequency, reported Captain Nakamura, whose job it was to coordinate Earth's counterintelligence operations. They're putting more processing power into their tracking algorithms. Let them, Reyes replied, with the kind of grim satisfaction that came from knowing something your opponent didn't. The more they analyze, the more they'll see what we want them to see. The human strategy was elegantly simple in concept and fiendishly complex in execution. Every aspect of human movement that the Zephyrians were monitoring had been carefully orchestrated to create the impression of chaos while actually implementing a coordinated global defense strategy. The random urban movements were cover for the positioning of military assets. The chaotic transportation patterns were masking the movement of personnel and equipment. The unpredictable individual behaviors were hiding the fact that millions of humans had been quietly moving into strategic positions over the course of years. Admiral Thorne reviewed the latest intelligence reports with the kind of professional appreciation that came from watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. The Zephyrians had been so focused on trying to understand human movement patterns that they'd completely missed the fact that the movements themselves were just the visible surface of a much deeper strategy. They were trying to track the dancers while remaining oblivious to the choreography. Phase 2 is ready to commence, Thorne announced to the assembled commanders. All assets are in position. All personnel are at their assigned stations, and our alien friends are still trying to figure out why humans go to shopping malls. The 5th week brought the revelation that changed everything, though it took the Zephyrians several more days to understand what they were looking at. The human movement patterns had stabilized into something that looked almost like a normal distribution, with population centers showing predictable flows and individual behaviors following recognizable patterns. For a brief moment, Dr. Crixana thought they had finally cracked the code of human behavior. That moment lasted exactly long enough for her to realize that the patterns were too perfect, too clean, too much like what the Zephyrians had expected to see in the first place. Real behavior, even organized behavior, contained irregularities and inefficiencies. The movement patterns they were now detecting were so optimized that they looked artificial, which meant they probably were artificial. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the kind of carefully controlled panic that suggested she was either about to deliver very bad news or request a transfer to a different department. "I believe we may have a problem." Bexthul studied the data displays with growing unease. The human movement patterns had indeed become more organized, but they were organized in a way that suggested the humans had been deliberately creating the appearance of chaos. The realization was like watching a magic trick in reverse. Once you knew how it was done, you couldn't understand how you'd been fooled in the first place. "They've been positioning themselves," he said slowly, as if speaking the words aloud would make them less true. "All this time, we thought we were tracking random movement, but they've been implementing a coordinated positioning strategy." The implications were staggering. If humans had been deliberately creating the appearance of chaos, while actually implementing a strategic plan, it meant they had been aware of Zephyrian surveillance from the beginning. It meant they had been sophisticated enough to fool tracking systems that had successfully monitored civilizations far more advanced than Earth's. Most disturbing of all, it meant they had been patient enough to maintain the deception for weeks while putting their own plans into motion. "Sir," Junior Analyst Morgak said in a voice that suggested he was about to make the situation considerably worse, "I've been analyzing the positioning patterns, and they conform to what appears to be a defensive arrangement. The humans haven't been moving randomly. They've been moving into strategic positions." The command center fell silent as the implications sank in. The Zephyrians had been hired to track human movement in order to predict and potentially control human expansion. Instead, they had been unknowingly cataloging the implementation of a defensive strategy that had been designed to counter exactly the kind of intervention they were supposed to be facilitating. Dr. Krixana's tentacles trembled as she processed additional data streams. "Commander, there's more. The positioning patterns suggest they've been preparing for this specific scenario. The defensive arrangements are optimized for countering orbital surveillance and tracking systems. They haven't just been hiding their movements, they've been preparing to neutralize our ability to track them." Bechthul felt something that might have been respect if it hadn't been so thoroughly mixed with horror. Humans had not only detected sophisticated alien surveillance, but they had also implemented a counter-strategy that used the surveillance itself as part of their defensive preparation. They had been patient enough to let the Zephyrians think they were succeeding, while actually being played like a particularly complex musical instrument. "The satellites," he said, his voice carrying the kind of dread that came from understanding exactly how thoroughly you'd been outmaneuvered, "they've been tracking our satellites." The final week brought revelations that transformed the entire situation from professional embarrassment to existential crisis. The human counterintelligence operation was revealed to be far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Not only had they been aware of Zephyrian surveillance, but they had also been using it to their advantage, feeding the alien tracking systems carefully curated information while simultaneously gathering intelligence on Zephyrian technology and capabilities. Captain Nakamura stood before a wall of displays showing the positions of every Zephyrian asset in Earth's vicinity. The aliens' tracking network, which they had thought was secretly monitoring human activity, had been compromised from the moment it was deployed. Human counter-surveillance systems had been tracking the trackers, analyzing their technology, and preparing countermeasures that would have impressed species with centuries more technological development. "We've been inside their network since day one," Nakamura reported to the assembled command staff. "Every piece of data they've collected, every analysis they've performed, every strategic assessment they've made, we've been watching it all in real time." The human strategy had been based on a fundamental understanding of alien psychology that the aliens themselves had failed to grasp. Most species that developed advanced tracking capabilities did so because they had evolved in environments where being able to predict and control movement was essential for survival. They assumed that all intelligent life would organize itself according to logical, predictable patterns, because that was how intelligent life had organized itself on their worlds. Humans, however, had evolved in an environment where survival often depended on being unpredictable, on being able to adapt to changing circumstances, and on being able to outthink predators that were faster, stronger, and better armed. They had developed not just the ability to be chaotic, but the ability to use chaos as a tool, to create the appearance of randomness while actually implementing sophisticated strategies. Admiral Thorne addressed the global command network with the kind of satisfaction that came from watching a plan succeed beyond all expectations. "Ladies and gentlemen, our guests have spent the last 6 weeks learning exactly nothing about human movement patterns, while we've spent the same time learning everything about Zephyrian tracking technology. I'd say that's a rather favorable exchange rate." The revelation that humans had been using alien surveillance technology to conduct their own intelligence operations was the kind of strategic reversal that would have been impressive if it weren't so completely terrifying. The Zephyrians had approached Earth with the assumption that they were dealing with a primitive species that needed to be monitored and controlled. Instead, they had encountered a species that had been monitoring and controlling them. Commander Bechthul stared at the displays showing human positions around the globe, finally understanding what he was looking at. The chaotic movement patterns that had confused their algorithms for weeks were revealed to be components of a coordinated defensive strategy that had been implemented with surgical precision. Humans hadn't been moving randomly at all. They had been moving into position. They weren't trying to avoid being tracked, he said, his voice carrying the kind of awe that came from recognizing superior strategy. They were letting us track them so they could track us. Dr. Krixana processed the final pieces of data with the kind of numb acceptance that came from understanding exactly how thoroughly they had been outplayed. The movement patterns, the positioning strategies, the defensive arrangements, they've been planning this for years, possibly decades. They've been preparing for alien surveillance since before we even knew they existed. The most disturbing aspect of the entire situation was the realization that humans had been patient enough to let the Zephyrians believe they were succeeding, while actually being manipulated into revealing their own capabilities. The chaos that had confused alien tracking systems hadn't been the result of primitive organizational skills. It had been a deliberately crafted illusion, designed to hide the fact that humanity had been preparing for exactly this scenario for longer than most species had been capable of interstellar travel. In the end, the Zephyrians had learned exactly what humans had wanted them to learn, that tracking a species that had evolved to be untrackable was not just difficult, but potentially catastrophic for the trackers themselves. They had been so focused on trying to understand human movement that they had completely missed the fact that the humans had been understanding them. General Reyes stood in the command center, watching as the last pieces of the human counterintelligence operation fell into place. The Zephyrians tracking satellites, which had been monitoring human activity for 6 weeks, were now effectively under human control. The alien tracking network had been turned into a human surveillance system, providing Earth with unprecedented intelligence on alien technology and capabilities. The irony, Reyes observed to his staff, is that they hired themselves to track us, and ended up teaching us how to track them. It's almost poetic. The final transmission from the Zephyrian tracking fleet was a study in alien bewilderment. Commander Vexthal's report to the Galactic Commerce Authority was a masterpiece of professional understatement that managed to convey both the complete failure of the mission and the complete success of the species they had been hired to monitor. Human movement patterns have been analyzed, the report concluded. However, we have determined that the subjects were not actually moving during the observation period. They were waiting. We respectfully recommend that any future interaction with this species be conducted with extreme caution, as they appear to be considerably more sophisticated than initial assessments suggested. The Galactic Commerce Authority received this report with the kind of bureaucratic confusion that came from paying premium prices for intelligence that essentially amounted to, "Be careful, they're smarter than we thought." They had hired the galaxy's premier tracking specialists to monitor a primitive species, only to discover that the primitive species had been monitoring them. The humans, meanwhile, had achieved something that would have been considered impossible by most galactic civilizations. They had turned an alien surveillance operation into a training exercise for their own counterintelligence capabilities. They had learned more about advanced alien technology in 6 weeks than some species learned in centuries of peaceful contact. Captain Nakamura filed the final report on the operation with the kind of professional satisfaction that came from a job well done. "Mission accomplished," she concluded. "The aliens tried to track our movement, but we weren't moving, we were waiting. And now we know exactly how to make sure they never find us when we don't want to be found." The Zephyrians departed Earth's solar system with their advanced tracking technology, their sophisticated analysis capabilities, and their complete inability to understand what had just happened to them. They had approached humanity with the assumption that any species could be tracked, monitored, and ultimately controlled, only to discover that some species had evolved specifically to avoid being tracked, monitored, or controlled. As their ships accelerated toward hyperspace, carrying news of their failure back to the Galactic Commerce Authority, the humans remained exactly where they had been for the past 6 weeks, in position, ready and waiting for the next species that thought it could predict human behavior. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of underestimating species that had evolved to be underestimated. The humans had learned considerably more about advanced alien technology than they had any right to know, and somewhere in the vast emptiness of space, other species were beginning to realize that the chaotic, unpredictable humans might be considerably more dangerous than anyone had previously imagined. After all, the most dangerous prey is the kind that chooses when and where to be hunted.